The first thing Lyra registered was the taste of victory. It was a fine vintage, of course. A deep, ruby-red Viridian wine that stained the lips and promised oblivion. It tasted of crushed grapes, of oak barrels, and of a future finally, securely, won. The great hall of the obsidian palace was a roaring sea of light and sound. 1,000 candles flickered in gilded sconces, their flames reflecting off polished marble and the jewel-encrusted goblets of the empire's most powerful. The air was thick with the scent of roasted peacock, spiced wine, and the cloying sweetness of triumph. And at the center of it all was Lyra. They called her the Nighthawk. The Emperor's shadow. The woman who moved pieces on the great board of statecraft while others slept, whose network of whispers stretched into every dark corner of the empire. For 10 years, she had been Prince Valerius's blade in the dark, his shield against the light. She had broken his enemies, uncovered conspiracies, and secured the throne that he now, finally, held unchallenged. Tonight was her victory as much as his. Her eyes found him across the throng. Valerius. No longer the prince, but the emperor in waiting, his coronation a mere formality now. The candlelight loved his face, gilding the sharp line of his jaw, the regal arch of his nose. He was laughing at something said by the woman on his arm, Lady Evangeline. Evangeline was everything Lyra was not. Where Lyra was all sharp edges and calculated silence, Evangeline was soft curves and tinkling laughter. Her gown was a cascade of moonlight silk, her hair a perfect fall of gold. The future empress. The politically perfect choice. A familiar, dull ache throbbed in Lyra's chest, an old wound she thought she had cauterized long ago. She had never asked for a crown. She had only ever asked for a look, a word, a fraction of the trust she had so freely given. She had believed that their partnership, forged in fire and shadow, was a bond stronger than any political marriage. She was a fool. To the Nighthawk. Valerius's voice cut through the din, rich and commanding. He raised his goblet, his eyes, the color of a summer storm, scanning the crowd until they found her. A hush fell. 1,000 faces turned in her direction. To the woman to whom I owe my crown, my life, and my empire. The shadows she walked for me have kept us all in the light. The applause was thunderous. It was a hero's tribute. It was her funeral derby. Valerius smiled, a brilliant, public thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. He gestured for a servant, who brought forward a single, exquisite crystal goblet on a silver tray. The emperor himself took it and walked toward her, the crowd parting like wheat before the scythe. This, he said, his voice dropping to an intimate timbre meant only for her, is from my private reserve. The last bottle from the year I was born. There is no one else worthy of it. He pressed the goblet into her hands. His fingers brushed against hers. They were warm. This is it, a voice, the old Nighthawk instinct, whispered in the back of her mind. Asterisk the final piece. The ultimate reward. The kill. Asterisk she looked into his face, this man she had loved with a fierceness that scared her. She saw the prince she had found bleeding in a forest, the ruler she had guided through countless crises, the friend who had shared secrets with her under a blanket of stars. She saw it all, and she chose, willfully, blissfully, to ignore the warning scream in her soul. She was tired of shadows. She wanted to believe in the light. To the future, she said, her voice clear and steady, echoing his toast from a lifetime ago when it had been just the two of them against the world. To the future, he echoed, his gaze unwavering. She brought the goblet to her lips and drank. The wine was smooth. It was complex. And beneath the notes of cherry and oak, there was a faint, bitter aftertaste, like almonds left too long in the sun. Asterisk Wolfsbane. Asterisk the knowledge clicked into place with a cold, professional finality. A spy's death. Quick, relatively clean, and utterly deniable. She met his eyes again. The warmth there had vanished, replaced by a terrifying, serene emptiness. It was the look he gave to a problem that had been successfully solved. Beside him, Lady Evangeline offered a small, placid smile. There was no malice in it. Only the satisfaction of a chess player who has just taken the opponent's queen. The pain began not as a stab, but as a cold numbness starting in her stomach, spreading outward like a frost blooming on a windowpane. Her fingers lost their strength. The exquisite goblet slipped from her grasp, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was like a dying star. The thunderous applause stuttered into a confused murmur. Lyra didn't hear it. The world was tilting. Her knees buckled, and strong hands, guards' hands, caught her before she hit the ground. Valerius was there in an instant, his face a masterpiece of concerned horror. Lyra. My friend. What is it? He cried, cradling her head. The act was flawless. For the crowd, he was the distraught patron, the grieving friend. She tried to speak, to curse him, to spit the truth in his face. But her tongue was a lead weight, her throat closing. The cold was in her veins now, a glacial river freezing her from the inside out. You promised, her mind screamed, the words trapped in a paralyzing prison of flesh. You promised we would build a new world. Together. His face was close to hers, his breath warm against her ear. The crowd saw a lover's farewell. They heard his choked sob. But she heard his words, whispered so softly they were barely a breath, the final, precise twist of the dagger. A shadow must fade, he murmured, his voice devoid of all emotion, when the sun rises. The last of the light drained from his eyes, from the room, from her. The sounds of the feast melted into a dull, roaring silence. The final thing she knew was the sensation of falling, not to the cold, hard marble, but into an endless, deep, and welcoming dark. The first thing Lyra registered was the smell. It wasn't the cloying scent of perfume and spilled wine, nor the metallic tang of blood. It was green. The crisp, clean aroma of drying lavender, the earthy punch of valerian root, the subtle sweetness of chamomile. It was a quiet smell, a peaceful smell. It was utterly alien. Then came the pain. Not the seizing, icy agony of wolfsbane shutting down her organs, but a dull, persistent throb behind her eyes, the kind that came from squinting at faded text for too long. Her eyes fluttered open. Sunlight. Not the guttering flame of candles, but bold, golden shafts of it, streaming through a small, lead-paned window and falling in warm patches on a worn wooden floor. She was lying in a narrow bed, a rough-spun wool blanket pulled up to her chin. She pushed herself up, her muscles protesting, feeling weak and soft. Her hands came into view. She stared at them. These were not her hands. The hands of the Nighthawk were a map of her life, a thin, silvery scar across the knuckles from a careless knife fight, calluses on her fingertips from gripping daggers and climbing ropes, nails kept short and practical. These hands were pale and slender, unmarred. The skin was smooth, the fingers delicate, tipped with neat, unbroken nails. They were the hands of a girl who had never held anything heavier than a quill. What sorcery is this? Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She threw the blanket off and swung her legs out of bed. The room spun for a moment before settling. It was small and Spartan. A simple wooden chest, a wash basin with a chipped ceramic pitcher, and a small desk piled high with books and sheaves of paper. A girl's room. A young girl's room. She stumbled to the wash basin, her legs unsteady, and looked into the small, tarnished mirror hanging above it. A stranger stared back. The face was young, perhaps 17 summers. It was framed by a cascade of unruly brown hair, much lighter than her own severe black. The eyes were the same shade of storm gray, wide and intelligent, but they were utterly devoid of the hard-won cynicism that had been her armor. The features were softer, prettier in a conventional, unremarkable way. There was no tension in the jaw, no calculating stillness in the expression. This was a face that had never been carved by betrayal, never been shaped by the necessity of lies. This is a dream. A poison-induced hallucination. She pinched the tender skin on her forearm, hard. A sharp pain flared, followed by a red mark. Real. It was all horrifyingly real. The door to the room creaked open, and a woman bustled in, carrying a tray. She was plump and kind-faced, with worry lines etched around her eyes and flour dusting her apron. Lyra. You're awake. Saints be praised, the woman breathed, her voice a mixture of relief and gentle scolding. I told you not to stay up all night with those ledgers. You fainted clean away in the kitchen, gave your father and me such a fright. Lyra. They had called her that, too. But this woman, this was, mother? The word felt foreign and rusty on her tongue. Who else would I be, silly goose? The woman, Ilara, set the tray down on the desk. It held a bowl of thin broth and a hunk of dark bread. Now, you eat this. No arguments. Your father is beside himself with worry. Debts or no debts, we won't have you working yourself into an early grave. Debts. Father. Fragments of a new life, a stranger's life, began to slot into place in her mind, not as memories, but as instinctual knowledge. She was Lyra, daughter of Kaelin and Alara, of the minor and impoverished house of, she almost laughed, Haven. They were so far removed from the seat of power they might as well be on the moon. Their estate was this modest house in a backwater town called Sunfall Village. Their nobility was a forgotten title and a mountain of obligations they could not hope to pay. Her father, Kaelin, was a kind, defeated man who spent his days sighing over account books he couldn't balance. And she was the daughter. The one who supposedly had a head for numbers, who tried to help, who had just fainted from overwork. The absurdity of it was so profound it was almost peaceful. Alara fussed over her for a few more minutes before leaving her with strict orders to rest. Lyra sat on the edge of the bed, the broth cooling on the desk, and looked at her new, soft hands. Valerius. The name was a shard of glass in her soul. She could still feel the ghost of his fingers brushing against hers, the warmth of his breath as he delivered his final, killing words. The taste of the wine, the bitter almond, flooded her mouth as a phantom memory. A wave of pure, undiluted rage threatened to consume her. It was a fire that wanted to burn this simple room, this peaceful village, this entire innocent world to ash. She wanted to scream. She wanted to find him, in this time or any other, and show him what a shadow could do when it refused to fade. But as quickly as it came, the fire guttered out, leaving behind a cold, vast emptiness. What was the point? To claw her way back to that gilded cage? To play the game of empires again, only to be discarded once she was no longer useful? To live her life defined by the man who had murdered her, no the resolution settled in her gut, cold and hard as a river stone. She would not be the Nighthawk again. She would not be a weapon, a spy, a shadow. She would not spend this precious, impossible second chance chasing the ghost of a man who deserved only her contempt. She stood and walked to the desk, pushing aside the boring ledgers of House Haven's failures. Beneath them was a map of the region, detailing trade routes between Sunfall Village and the larger port city of Havenport. It was crude, inaccurate in places, but it was a start. Her mind, the mind that had once orchestrated the fall of dukes and the routing of armies, began to work again. But this time it was not for a crown. She remembered, with the perfect clarity of her past life, a report that had crossed her desk. A blight had struck the southern farmlands of Viridia 2 summers from now, in this timeline, causing a famine that would make common grains worth their weight in silver. But here, in the northern climes near Sunfall, a hardy, overlooked tuber called sunroot grew wild. It was considered peasant food, fit only for livestock. But it was immune to the blight. A plan, simple and elegant, began to form. Not a plot for power, but a scheme for profit. For freedom. She picked up a quill from the desk. It felt awkward and fragile in her unfamiliar hand. She dipped it in an inkwell and, on a fresh piece of paper, she began to write. Not a secret missive or a coded letter. A list. *1. Secure capital. How? 2. Acquire all available sunroot seed. Cheaply. 3. Lease the fallow fields on the western hill. Old man Hemlock will be desperate for coin. 4. Wait. She looked at the words, at the clumsy, ink-stained script of a young girl named Lyra. It was a far cry from the precise, authoritative hand of the Nighthawk. A slow, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. It felt strange on this new face. Let Valerius have his throne. Let him play his games of intrigue and betrayal. She had a new game to play now. The game of commerce. And she was going to win. The following weeks were a lesson in a new kind of warfare. The battlefield was the dusty lanes and cramped shops of Sunfall Village. The enemy was not a scheming duke but simple, ingrained poverty, and her weapons were not daggers but whispers, promises, and a handful of copper coins. Her first task was capital. The Haven family coffers were, as her new instincts had warned, not just empty, but actively hostile, filled with nothing but IOUs and faded promises. Asking her father for money was out of the question. The defeated slump of his shoulders whenever he looked at his ledgers was answer enough. So, the Nighthawk went to work. She started with a single silver hairpin, a modest heirloom her mother had given the other Lyra. It was the only thing of value she could call her own. She sold it to the portly jeweler in Havenport for a fraction of its worth, his eyes glinting with avarice. The handful of silver coins felt pitifully light in her palm, a stark contrast to the imperial treasuries she had once manipulated. But it was a start. Next, she needed information. In her old life, she would have summoned a network of invisible agents. Here, she had to become the agent herself. She spent days in the Sunfall Tavern, not drinking, but listening. She offered to help the innkeeper's daughter with her sums in exchange for gossip. She lingered at the market, complimenting the weaver on her dyes while subtly steering the conversation toward land disputes and local harvests. She learned that Old Man Hemlock, who owned the vast, rocky western fields, was indeed desperate. His son had run off to join a mercenary company, leaving him with land he couldn't work and taxes he couldn't pay. He was weeks from losing it all. This was her opportunity. She approached him one evening as he sat on his porch, whittling a piece of wood with a shaking hand. The Nighthawk would have used intimidation or complex leverage. Lyra of House Haven used pity and a simple offer. "Master Hemlock," she began, her voice soft, unthreatening. "I heard about your troubles. It's a shame to see good land go to waste." He grunted, not looking up. "Ain't good land. It's rocks and spite." "What do you want, girl?" "I want to lease it from you. For a season." That got his attention. His watery blue eyes narrowed. "Lease it? For what? You gonna plant pretty flowers?" "Something like that," she said with a gentle smile. "I have a notion to try a new crop. A failure would be on my head, not yours. But if it works, you'd have your lease money now, and a percentage of the yield later. Enough to pay your taxes and maybe see you through the winter." She saw the calculation in his eyes. Desperation warring with suspicion. Why would this slip of a girl, from a family that was barely hanging on themselves, want his worthless field? "It's a fool's errand," he muttered. "Perhaps," Lyra agreed easily. "But it's my errand to be a fool on. All I ask is for the chance. And you get paid regardless." She placed half of her meager silver coins on the wooden railing beside him. The clink of metal was a powerful argument. He stared at the money, then at her, and finally gave a slow, grudging nod. "1 season. And I want 10% of whatever you manage to scrape from that cursed ground." 5, Lyra countered, not unkindly. "And I'll have my father's man help you fix your roof before the rains come." The old man blinked, thrown by the unexpected kindness. The Nighthawk knew that a favor, a personal connection, was often a stronger bond than fear. He nodded again, this time with less reluctance. 5. And the roof. The land was hers. Now for the seed. Sunroot was considered a weed, a food of last resort. It grew in tangled, stubborn patches in the scrubland at the edge of the village. No one owned it, it was just there. Lyra spent the next week with a burlap sack, her soft hands becoming raw and blistered as she dug up the gnarled, brown tubers. She ignored the curious stares and occasional laughs from the villagers. Let them think the Haven girl had finally cracked under the strain of her family's debt. It was the perfect camouflage. Her back ached, her muscles screamed, and at night she fell into her narrow bed so exhausted that the dreams of poison and betrayal couldn't find her. It was a blessing. She leased the field, she planted the sunroot with the help of a few coppers paid to some local boys, and then, she waited. This was the hardest part. The Nighthawk was a creature of action, of immediate cause and effect. Farming was an exercise in faith. Faith in the sun, the rain, and the memory of a report from another life. To keep her mind sharp and to continue building her capital, she turned to other small ventures. Using the last of her coins, she bought a batch of cheap, undyed wool from a frustrated merchant. She remembered a dye recipe from the southern islands, a combination of local moss and iron-rich mud, that produced a unique, deep gray-green. She experimented in a cauldron behind the house, her mother watching with a mixture of worry and fascination. The resulting color was beautiful, the color of a stormy sea. She sold the bolts of cloth in Havenport for triple what she paid, not as Lyra Haven, but through a talkative market stall owner she gave a small cut. The silent partner was born. Months passed. The seasons turned. The scraggly sunroot plants flourished on the rocky western hill, their broad leaves a vibrant green against the gray stone. People stopped laughing and started watching. Then, the first rumor reached Sunfall, carried by a wide-eyed trader from the south. A strange blight. It was withering the wheat and barley in Viridia. The word famine was whispered, followed by the sharp, metallic taste of panic. The price of all stable foodstuffs began to climb. Lyra watched it all with a calm that felt alien to her new, youthful body. This was the moment. The harvest was ready. The sunroot tubers were fat and healthy, buried safely in the blight-proof earth. She organized the harvest, paying the same local boys in hard currency while every other landowner was hoarding their coin. The yield was enormous. She filled their modest barn, then rented Old Man Hemlock's own barn, paying him in more silver that made his eyes bulge. When the merchants from the capital, desperate and armed with imperial purses, finally reached Sunfall, they found a near monopoly. The silent partner owned almost all the available, blight-resistant food in the region. Lyra didn't meet them herself. She used the now loyal Old Man Hemlock as her front, feeding him the numbers and the minimum prices. He, grizzled and intimidating, drove a hard bargain. The silver and gold that flowed into their hands was more than House Haven had seen in a generation. That night, she sat at the family's rough-hewn table and placed a heavy leather purse in front of her father. Kalen stared at it, then at her, his face a tapestry of confusion and dawning hope. "Lyra, how? What is this?" "It's enough," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Enough to pay our debts. All of them." Her mother, Elara, let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth. Her father just continued to stare, as if she had performed magic. "The sunroot, it was your idea," he whispered, awe in his voice. "You saved us." Lyra looked at their faces, at the sheer, uncomplicated love and relief shining in their eyes. It was a victory, yes. But it felt nothing like toppling a rival or securing a throne. This warmth that spread through her chest was different. It was quieter. It was real. She had set out to buy her freedom, and she had. But she had bought something else, too. Something she hadn't known she was missing. A place to belong. But as she looked out the window at the darkening sky, a cold sliver of her old self whispered a warning. A move this bold, no matter how carefully concealed, creates ripples. And ripples have a way of traveling far, sometimes even to the feet of a throne. The gold changed everything, and nothing at all. The heavy, clinking purse Lyra placed on the table didn't just settle their debts, it lifted a physical weight from the very timbers of the house. Her father, Kalen, stood a little taller. The perpetual worry line between his brows softened. Her mother, Elara, began to hum again while she worked, old folk tunes Lyra had never heard before. The air in the house lost its taste of desperation and gained the gentle flavor of baking bread and hope. Lyra allowed herself, for the first time, to breathe. She invested the remaining gold wisely, but quietly. A small share in a reliable coastal trader, a stash of high quality wool put aside for the winter, a new roof for their own house. She was building a foundation, not an empire. The silent partner had made her one big, calculated strike, and now she was content to fade back into the scenery, a minor noble girl with a surprisingly good head for household management. She even started to enjoy it. The simple satisfaction of balancing a ledger that stayed in the black. The tactile pleasure of tending the herb garden she'd started behind the kitchen. The mindless, peaceful rhythm of kneading dough alongside her mother. These were victories that left no blood on her hands, that required no lies, that betrayed no one. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, the sun warm on her back as she weeded a patch of thyme, that the peace was broken. It started as a sound, the rhythmic, metallic clatter of armed men on the move. Not the shuffling, disorganized tread of the village watch, but the disciplined, synchronized step of professional soldiers. The sound grew, cutting through the lazy hum of sunfall like a knife. Lyra froze, a clump of weeds dangling from her fingers. Her heart, which had learned to beat a slow, steady rhythm, suddenly hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't need to look. She knew that sound. It was the sound of the Imperial Guard. The sound of him. No. It can't be. Not here. She slowly rose, wiping her earthy hands on her apron, her movements deliberately calm. She walked to the front of the house, her pulse a frantic drum in her ears. The sight that greeted her was as surreal as it was terrifying. A troop of a dozen guards in polished steel and the deep blue livery of the royal house stood at rigid attention in the dusty village square, their presence making the humble surroundings seem like a painted backdrop. And there, standing before them, his back to her as he surveyed the village with an air of bewildered contempt, was Prince Valerius. He was younger. so much younger than the man who had poisoned her. His face lacked the final, hardened edges of a crowned ruler, but the arrogance was there, etched into the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his chin. This was the Valerius of her early days, the brilliant, beautiful, and infuriatingly entitled prince who believed the world existed for his convenience. And he was currently standing 10 paces from her front door. Her father, Kalen, had emerged from the house, his face pale. He bowed deeply, his movements stiff with fear and confusion. "Your Highness. To what do we owe this immense honor?" Valerius turned, and for a heart-stopping second, his storm-gray eyes, so like her own, yet so cold, swept right over Lyra, dismissing her as part of the rustic scenery. He focused on her father. "Lord Haven," Valerius said, his voice cutting through the air. It was the same voice, the one that had once whispered secrets and later, a death sentence. "I am searching for someone. A strategist. A planner. I have been told a person of remarkable foresight resides here. Someone they call the silent partner." Lyra's blood ran cold. How, she had been so careful. The sun route, the dyes, the investments, all channeled through intermediaries, all designed to be untraceable. Kalen looked utterly baffled. "The silent partner? Your Highness, I know of no such person. We are simple people here. Perhaps you have been misinformed?" "I am never misinformed," Valerius said, a flicker of the imperiousness she remembered so well crossing his face. He was frustrated, she realized. Desperate. The calm, controlled mask of the future emperor was cracking, revealing the raw, panicked young man beneath. This partner predicted the Viridian blight. They secured a fortune from it. "My informants traced the flow of gold here, to Sunfall, to your house." His eyes swept over their modest home again, his disbelief palpable. "Where are they?" "This is a matter of imperial security." Lyra knew she had to act. If he focused on her father, his clumsy interrogation would eventually lead to her. The Nighthawk's mind, dormant for months, snapped back into focus. The frightened girl in the garden vanished, replaced by the cool, analytical spymaster. She stepped forward, before her father could stammer another reply. She kept her eyes downcast, her voice a little too high, playing the part of the nervous, rustic noble girl to perfection. "Father," she said, feigning a slight tremble. "Perhaps the prince means old man Hemlock? He was the one who sold all those strange roots. He came into quite a bit of gold recently. He's been talking." It was a gamble. A deflection. Point the predator toward another, easier target. Valerius's gaze snapped to her. This time, he really looked at her. She felt his eyes on her, a physical weight. She forced herself to blush, to look away, to fidget with the edge of her apron. "Hemlock?" Valerius repeated, his tone skeptical. "Yes, Your Highness," Lyra said, bobbing a clumsy curtsy. "He's always been a bit of a braggart. Since he sold his crop, he's been telling everyone in the tavern that he saw the future in the soil." She let a hint of girlish gossip seep into her voice. "Silly, really." For a long moment, Valerius was silent, studying her. She could feel the intensity of his scrutiny, and for a terrifying second, she was sure he saw right through her, through the soft skin and the wide eyes, straight to the Nighthawk's soul hiding within. Then, he sighed, the sound full of weary disappointment. A braggart farmer, he muttered to himself, as if the very notion offended him. He had come seeking a mastermind and was being offered a village fool. He turned back to Kalen. "Very well. Where can I find this Hemlock?" As her father gave directions, Valerius glanced back at Lyra one last time. There was no recognition in his eyes, only a vague irritation at the interruption. He saw a simple, pretty girl from a backwater province. Nothing more. He and his guards marched off toward Hemlock's farm, their polished boots kicking up the humble village dust. Lyra stood frozen long after they had disappeared from view. The warmth of the sun was gone, replaced by an inner ice. The confrontation was over. She had won. She had turned him away. But he had been here. He had stood on her doorstep. The past wasn't just a memory, it was a hunter, and it had her scent. Her father turned to her, his face still pale. "Lyra, what was that about? Why would the prince come here?" She made herself smile, a fragile, unconvincing thing. "I don't know, father. The whims of princes are strange. But inside, the Nighthawk was already calculating, planning, building new walls. The game was not over. It had just begun anew, and the stakes were no longer gold, but her very soul. The sun had barely begun its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, when the clatter of hooves and armor returned. Lyra, who had been trying and failing to focus on mending a linen sheet, felt the needle prick her finger. A single bead of blood welled, vivid against the pale fabric. A fitting omen. Prince Valerius did not return with the triumphant air of a man who had found his quarry. His posture was rigid, his expression a thundercloud. He dismissed his guards with a sharp gesture, leaving them stationed at the end of the lane like grim statues, and strode back to the haven doorstep alone. This time, he didn't wait for an invitation. His gaze, sharp and relentless, found Lyra through the open window. Kalen opened the door, his nervousness having curdled into outright fear. "Your Highness. Did you find Master Hemlock?" Hemlock is a half-senile old man who thinks crop rotation is a form of witchcraft, Valerius bit out, his voice dripping with contempt. He didn't even look at Kalen. His eyes were locked on Lyra. The gold in his possession came from a series of instructions delivered by a boy he cannot describe, paid for with silver that traces back to a series of untraceable transactions. He took a step into their home, his presence making the cozy main room feel claustrophobic. "It seems the silent partner is more meticulous than I assumed." Lyra kept her head bowed over her mending, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Asterisk play the part. "You are no one. You are nothing." Asterisk Your Highness, Kalen tried, his voice trembling. "We know nothing, be silent," Valerius commanded, not loudly, but with a tone that brooked no argument. It was the voice of a prince who had never been denied. He walked slowly toward Lyra, his boots silent on the rush-strewn floor. He stopped before her, so close she could smell the scent of horse, steel, and the faint, expensive sandalwood soap he had always used. "You," he said. "Look at me." Slowly, Lyra raised her eyes. She let them be wide, slightly unfocused, filled with the appropriate terror of a common girl facing royalty. She saw the sharp, handsome lines of his face, the intensity in his stormy eyes that she had once foolishly believed was meant only for her. "You were very quick to direct me to Hemlock," he stated, his voice deceptively soft. "Almost, strategically so." "Forgive me, Your Highness," she whispered, letting her voice quaver. I only spoke what the whole village knows. I meant no offense." She dropped her gaze again, a picture of demure submission. For a long moment, he was silent, simply staring down at the crown of her head. The silence stretched, taut and dangerous. Then, he did something that shocked her to her core. He knelt. It was not a gesture of romance, but of scrutiny. He lowered himself to one knee, bringing his face level with hers, forcing her to look at him. His proximity was a physical assault. She could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the tiny scar above his brow from a long-ago training accident, a story he had told her under a different sky. "Who are you?" he asked, the question a low, intimate whisper that felt like a violation. "I am Lyra Haven, Your Highness," she stammered, clutching the mending to her chest like a shield. "Daughter of Kalen and Alara." "Lyra Haven," he repeated, tasting the name. "A girl who faints over ledgers, yet knows enough to point a prince toward a decoy." His eyes narrowed. "Tell me, Lyra Haven, do you also have a head for strategy? For predicting blights and market fluctuations?" Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. He was piecing it together, not with evidence, but with instinct. The same predator's instinct that had always made him so formidable. "Strategy, Your Highness?" She forced a breathy, confused laugh. "I barely understand our household accounts. My mother says my head is full of poetry and daydreams." She looked toward her mother, who was standing frozen by the hearth, her face ashen. Valerius's eyes didn't leave hers. He was searching, probing, trying to peel back the layers of the timid girl to see the sharp mind he sensed lurking beneath. He reached out, and before she could flinch away, he plucked the mending from her hands. He looked at the neat, even stitches, then at the small spot of blood from where she had pricked herself. "A careless mistake," he murmured, his thumb brushing over the crimson dot. The touch sent a jolt of revulsion through her. Or a sign of a distracted mind? He stood up abruptly, turning his back on her as if she were a puzzle he had temporarily set aside. He addressed her father. "Lord Haven." It seems the trail for the person I seek has grown cold in your charming village. I and my retinue will be staying at the inn. We will resume our search tomorrow. He was lying. He wasn't giving up. He was digging in. Kalen bowed. Of course, Your Highness. Whatever you require. Valerius paused at the door, his hand on the frame. He didn't look back at Lyra, but his words were meant for her alone, carrying a weight of grim promise. Until tomorrow, Lyra Haven, he said softly. I find myself immensely curious about your daydreams. And then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any shout. The moment the door closed, Alara rushed to Lyra's side, pulling her into a tight embrace. Oh, my dear girl, what was that? Why is he so interested in you? Kalen sank into a chair, his head in his hands. This is a disaster. We have attracted the attention of the crown prince. There is no good that can come from this. Lyra stood stiffly in her mother's arms, her eyes fixed on the spot where he had knelt. The ghost of his touch on the fabric felt like a brand. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being slowly, inexorably, consumed by a hotter, more familiar emotion, fury. He was hunting her. Again. In this life, in this quiet village, he was still trying to trap her, to use her, to own her. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. She gently extricated herself from her mother. It will be all right, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He is a prince with a whim. He will grow bored and leave. She walked to the window, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the hills. The prince thought he was a hunter stalking a frightened rabbit. He had no idea that the rabbit's burrow hid the den of a nighthawk. A slow, cold smile touched her lips, unseen by her parents. Let him be curious, she thought, the strategist within rising to the challenge. Asterisk, let him pry. Let him try to unravel the mystery of Lyra Haven. It will be the most fascinating failure of his life. Asterisk, the oppressive weight of Prince Valerius's presence settled over Sunfall village like a fog. His guards were a constant reminder, their polished armor glinting ominously in the humble sunlight. Valerius himself had taken to inspecting the village, which largely involved asking pointed questions about trade, finances, and the Haven family, his inquiries barely veiled in royal courtesy. Lyra felt the walls of her new life closing in. Everywhere she went, she felt his gaze, or the gaze of one of his men. She was a butterfly pinned under glass, and the collector was studying her with an unnerving, possessive interest. The nighthawk's instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to strike back. But the girl, Lyra Haven, had nowhere to go. After 3 days of this suffocating surveillance, she could take it no longer. She told her parents she was going to Havenport to purchase dyes, a plausible excuse they readily accepted, desperate for any semblance of normalcy. What she truly sought was the one thing Sunfall could no longer offer, anonymity. Havenport was a balm to her frayed nerves. The city was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of shouting merchants, creaking ship hulls, and the cries of gulls. Here, she was no one. Just another face in the bustling crowd. She breathed in the salty, fishy, free air, feeling her shoulders loosen for the first time in days. Her errand at the dyer's warehouse was quick. With the bulk of her business complete, she found herself drawn to the docks, to the endless horizon of the sea. She stood at the end of a pier, watching the white sails of merchant vessels carve paths through the blue, imagining where they might be going. Anywhere but here. A copper for your thoughts, a voice said beside her. It was a warm voice, rough with the sea and laughter, devoid of the calculating sharpness she was so used to. She turned. Leaning against a stack of crates was a man a few years her senior. He was tall and lean, his skin tanned the color of teak by sun and salt. His hair was a sun-bleached brown, tied back with a leather thong, and his eyes were the clear, untroubled blue of the summer sky. He wore practical, sturdy clothes, a worn leather jerkin over a simple tunic, and he moved with the easy, rolling grace of someone who spent his life on a shifting deck. My thoughts are worth far less than a copper, I assure you, Lyra replied, offering a small, genuine smile. It felt strange on her face after days of forced politeness and hidden panic. I'll be the judge of that, he said, pushing off the crates and coming to stand beside her. He followed her gaze out to the sea. Dreaming of far-off places? Something like that, she admitted. It seems simpler out there. Simpler, and wetter, he chuckled. But it has its charms. No lords, no taxes, just the wind, the waves, and your own 2 hands. He extended one of those hands, calloused and strong. Corbin. Captain of the Sea Serpent. He gestured to a sleek, 2-masted schooner tied up nearby. It looked fast and capable, much like its captain. She took his hand. His grip was firm and honest. Lyra, she said, deciding in that moment to shed the weight of her family name. Just Lyra. Well, just Lyra, he said, a mischievous glint in his eyes. What brings a woman who looks like she's carrying the world's troubles to a smelly dock? The directness of the question, so devoid of ulterior motive, was disarming. She couldn't tell him the truth, but she found she didn't want to lie. I suppose I needed to remember that the world is bigger than my village. Corbin nodded as if that made perfect sense. Aye, that it is. There are islands out there with sands as pink as a sunrise, and waters so clear you can see the shadows of fish 100 feet down. Places where they've never even heard of the Obsidian Empire. The way he said it, not with rebellion, but with a simple, profound love for freedom, struck a chord deep within her. This was the antithesis of Valerius. Where the prince offered a gilded cage and the weight of a throne, Corbin offered the horizon and the weight of nothing at all. They talked. He told her tales of navigating by the stars, of trading for spices in ports where the air smelled of cinnamon and mystery, of outrunning pirates in a gale. She, in turn, asked intelligent questions about trade winds and commodity values, surprising him with her acuity. She carefully framed it as a merchant's daughter's curiosity, and he accepted it without suspicion. For the first time since her rebirth, she was having a conversation that wasn't a performance. There were no layers, no hidden meanings, no need to guard every word. She was just a woman, and he was just a man, and the sea was before them. Back in Sunfall, as dusk began to paint the sky, Prince Valerius stood outside the Haven residence. He had spent the day fruitlessly chasing shadows, his frustration mounting. His informants had nothing. The girl, Lyra, was an enigma wrapped in a facade of simplicity that was, he was now convinced, a masterwork of deception. He saw Kaelin returning from a walk, looking weary. Lord Haven, Valerius called out, his voice cutting through the evening quiet. I did not see your daughter today. Kaelin jumped, startled. Why, your highness? Lyra? She went to Havenport. 4 dies. Havenport. The trade city. The hub of information and commerce. Of course. A cold, possessive jealousy, sharp and entirely unexpected, twisted in Valerius's gut. Was she meeting someone? The real silent partner, perhaps? Or was she, somehow, operating on her own, alone, he asked, his tone dangerously soft. She often goes, your highness. She's a good girl, very capable, Kaelin said, his voice pleading, as if begging the prince to believe him. Valerius said nothing. He merely stared down the empty road that led to Havenport, his mind a whirlwind of suspicion and a burgeoning, obsessive need. The puzzle of Lyra Haven was no longer just an imperial concern. It had become personal. He had to know. He had to possess the truth of her. 2 men. One on a dock, offering the world. The other in a village, building a prison of his own obsession. And Lyra, caught between them, felt the first real tug of a choice she never thought she'd have to make again. The scent of smoke woke her. It wasn't the clean, comforting aroma of a hearth fire, but the acrid, greedy smell of burning timber and oil. Lyra's eyes snapped open in the dark. The nighthawk was instantly, terrifyingly alert, every sense screaming. She was at the window in a heartbeat, throwing open the shutters. An orange glow painted the night sky, coming from the direction of Havenport. Not the whole city, the light was too concentrated. Her heart seized in her chest. Asterisk the warehouse district. Her warehouse. The one she had secretly leased under a false name to store the bulk of her remaining sunroot profits and the valuable, undyed wool she was accumulating for the winter. The foundation of her family's new security. The tangible proof of her freedom. This was no accident. The thought was as cold and sharp as a dagger. Valerius's enemies, the same faction that had been making moves against the crown in her past life, were here. This was their method: destabilize the region, create economic chaos, and weaken the prince's standing. They must have traced the unusual flow of capital, the same as Valerius had, but where he sought to recruit the mind behind it, they sought to destroy it. They saw the silent partner not as a person, but as an asset of the crown. And they were burning her out. A white-hot fury, purer and more focused than any she had felt in this new life, ignited within her. They thought they could burn her? They thought she was some helpless merchant to be intimidated. She dressed in the dark, her movements swift and silent. The frightened girl was gone, shed like a second skin. The nighthawk pulled on the trousers and tunic she used for gardening, tying her hair back with a ruthless efficiency. She slipped out of her window, melting into the shadows of the sleeping village with an ease that should have been impossible for Lyra Haven. She didn't take the main road. She took the hunter's path she had memorized on her long walks, her soft-soled boots making no sound on the forest floor. She ran, not with a girl's panic, but with a spy's determined pace, her mind racing faster than her feet. By the time she reached the outskirts of Havenport, the fire was a roaring beast, consuming her warehouse. A bucket brigade of panicked citizens was fighting a losing battle, the flames laughing at their efforts. The air was thick with smoke and shouting. And there, on the edge of the chaos, she saw him. Corbin. He wasn't watching the fire. He was directing his crew from the Sea Serpent, a solid, calm presence in the madness. "Soak the roofs on either side," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the din. "Don't let it spread. Forget the center, it's gone." His eyes, scanning the crowd, found hers. They widened in shock, then narrowed in confusion. She knew how she must look, wild-eyed, hair escaping its tie, her clothes dark and practical, her posture not one of horror, but of furious, calculated assessment. He broke away from his men and strode toward her. "Lyra? What in the seven seas are you doing here? It's not safe." "There's lamp oil in the west corner," she said, her voice low and urgent, ignoring his question. "If the fire reaches it, it'll blow out the entire wall and take the chandler's shop with it. They need to wet down that entire side, now." Corbin stared at her. The command in her voice, the specific, tactical knowledge, it was utterly at odds with the woman he'd met on the docks. For a heartbeat, he was too stunned to move. "Now, Corbin," she snapped, the authority of the nighthawk cracking through. It broke his paralysis. He nodded, a sharp, decisive motion, and turned, roaring new orders to his men. They obeyed without question, redirecting their efforts. Lyra didn't wait. She moved through the crowd, her gaze sharp. She was looking for faces that didn't belong. Men who were watching the fire not with panic or sympathy, but with satisfaction. She saw them, 3 of them, standing in the shadow of a nearby tavern, their clothes too fine for this part of the docks. One of them met her gaze, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Recognition. And a challenge. The nighthawk knew that look. It was the look of a man who had completed his mission. The fight against the fire lasted until dawn. When it was over, her warehouse was a smoldering ruin, but the swift action had saved the surrounding businesses. The chandler's shop was scorched but standing. She had lost everything inside, the gold, the wool, her financial safety net. But she had saved the town a greater catastrophe. As the sun rose, painting the scene in hues of gray and gold, exhaustion finally claimed her. She leaned against a water barrel, her face smudged with soot, her body trembling with adrenaline crash. A blanket was draped over her shoulders. Corbin stood beside her, his own face streaked with grime. "You saved half the dock," he said quietly, his voice thick with fatigue and something else, awe, and confusion. "How did you know about the lamp oil?" She closed her eyes. The facade was shattered. There was no going back to just Lyra with him. I have a good memory for layouts," she whispered, a weak and pathetic excuse. He was silent for a long moment. "Lyra," he finally said, his tone gentle but firm. "I've sailed the world. I've met kings and pirates and merchants of every stripe. I know the difference between a merchant's daughter and a general on a battlefield." He gestured to the organized chaos around them, a direct result of her orders. That wasn't luck. That was command. She had no answer. The truth was a fortress she could not let him breach. He didn't press. Instead, he said the words that truly undid her. "Whoever you're running from," he murmured, looking not at the fire, but at the road leading back to Sunfall, "they found you, didn't they?" Tears she didn't know she had left welled in her eyes, cutting clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. She just nodded, a tiny, broken motion. Corbin's jaw tightened. He looked from her devastated face to the smoldering ruin, and then back to the road, as if he could see the shadow of the prince looming over it all. My ship is being loaded, he said, his voice low and earnest. We sail with the evening tide. For the Southern Isles, and then wherever the wind takes us. There's a cabin. It's yours if you want it. You and your family. No questions asked. It was an offer of salvation. A clean escape. The very thing she had dreamed of. But as she looked at the wreckage of her dreams, at the evidence of the war that was already hunting her, she knew it wasn't that simple. Running now would only make Valerius hunt her harder. It would paint a target on Corbin's back. And a small, dark, unforgiving part of her, the Nighthawk, was done running. She looked at Corbin, her eyes full of a sorrow too deep for her young face. I can't, she whispered. Not yet. The battle had been brought to her doorstep. It was time to stop being the merchant and remember who she was. The shadow was ready to strike back. The smell of smoke clung to her hair and clothes for days, a permanent reminder of the line that had been crossed. The frightened, passive Lyra had burned away in that fire, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. The Nighthawk was done hiding in the shadow of a merchant's daughter. Her family was terrified, huddled in their home as if expecting the walls to be torn down around them. Lyra offered them no comforting lies. We were targeted, she told them, her voice calm and flat. Because of the money. It will not happen again. She said it with such finality that they could only stare, bewildered by the transformation in their daughter. The girl who fainted over ledgers now stood with the unnerving stillness of a general surveying a battlefield. Her first move was not one of violence, but of information. The Nighthawk's greatest weapon had always been her network. She had none here. So, she built one. She went to Old Man Hemlock, not as a girl, but as a partner. She found him staring at the charred remains of his own small storage shed, which had caught a stray ember. He looked old and broken. They burned us, girl, he croaked, his voice hollow. No, Lyra corrected, her tone cutting. They tried to. And they failed. She placed a fresh purse of silver in his hand, heavier than the last. This is for the shed. And for your eyes and ears. The men who did this are still in Havenport. They are proud. They will talk. I want to know where they drink, who they brag to, what names they use. Hemlock looked from the silver to her face, and for the first time, he didn't see Lord Haven's daughter. He saw the silent partner. He saw a leader. He gave a grim, determined nod. Next, she used Corbin. Not for shelter, but for his access to the port's underbelly. She met him on the Sea Serpent, the deck bustling with preparations for a voyage he had now postponed. You're staying? He had asked, hope and worry warring in his eyes. Until this is finished, she said. I need your crew to listen. Sailors hear everything. I need to know which merchants have recently made large, unexplained payments. Which ones are suddenly nervous. Corbin didn't question her. He simply nodded. Consider it done. The pieces came together with stunning speed. Hemlock's grandson, a quick-witted boy, tracked the three men to a seedy tavern called the Drunken Mermaid. Corbin's first mate learned of a merchant named Sloane, a purveyor of fine oils and textiles, who had recently sold a massive quantity of lamp oil for cash, no questions asked. Sloane. The name was a key turning in a lock in her mind. In her past life, he had been a minor financier for the Western dukes who opposed Valerius. He was the money man. The fire starter. The Nighthawk smiled. It was not a pleasant sight. She did not confront him with steel. She broke him with paper. She discovered, through a combination of Hemlock's gossip and her own knowledge of imperial tax law, that Sloane was heavily leveraged. He had borrowed extensively to fund his legitimate business, using it as a front for his darker dealings. His creditors were a consortium of hard-nosed moneylenders in the capital. Lyra, using the last of her carefully hidden reserves, anonymously bought up a significant portion of Sloane's debt. Then, she began her play. First, a rumor spread through the merchant guild: Sloane's investments in the Viridian farmlands had been a catastrophic failure due to the blight. It was a lie, but a plausible one. Then, a lost shipment of his most expensive textiles was reported, a shipment that had never existed. The whispers of his instability grew. Panicked, Sloane called in his own favors and called in his own debts from smaller businesses to stay afloat. This was the pressure Lyra had been waiting for. She struck the final blow herself. She walked into the Merchant Guild Hall in Havenport, no longer dressed as a simple village girl, but in a severe, dark gray dress that echoed the uniforms of the imperial clerks. She carried a single, sealed document. She found Sloane in a heated argument with a ship's captain about a delayed payment. "Master Sloane," she said, her voice clear and carrying, silencing the room. He turned, his face a mask of irritation that quickly morphed into confusion upon seeing her. "Who are you?" "Lyra Haven. I believe you are familiar with my work. Some call me the silent partner." The air left the room. Every merchant, every captain, froze. The silent partner was a myth, a ghost. And she was standing before them, a young woman with eyes as cold as a winter sea. Sloane paled. You're the owner of a significant portion of your debt," she finished for him, placing the document on the table between them. "Effective immediately, the repayment terms are void. The full sum is due now." He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. I can't. This is impossible. You'll ruin me." Lyra leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear, yet it seemed to echo in the silent hall. "You tried to burn me out. You targeted my family. Ruin is a mercy compared to what I could do." She tapped the document. "Pay what you owe, or I will seize every asset you have down to the nails in your shoes. Your creditors in the capital will be informed of your extracurricular activities. I wonder how long you will last in a debtor's prison?" She didn't wait for his answer. She turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. It took 3 days. Sloane, stripped of his credit and his reputation, was forced to sell everything at a loss to pay her. He was left a broken man, fleeing Havenport in the dead of night. The 3 thugs, no longer paid, vanished into the underworld from whence they came. The war was over. She had won. Not with a single, glorious battle, but with a quiet, systematic annihilation. And from the balcony of his room at the Sunfall Inn, Prince Valerius watched it all. He had heard the rumors, seen the economic tremors. He had witnessed Lyra Haven walk into the guild hall and emerge, unscathed, while a respected merchant was utterly destroyed. He saw the fear and respect in the eyes of the townspeople when she passed. He stood there, a forgotten glass of wine in his hand, as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The brilliant, ruthless strategy. The economic assassination. The cold, precise execution. It wasn't just familiar. It was a signature. His glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floorboards. The sound didn't register. He stared at the distant figure of Lyra, walking back to her home, her head held high, and a terrifying, impossible, soul-shattering realization dawned on him. The mind behind the silent partner. The ghost that haunted this village. The woman who looked at him with such deep-seated hatred. It was the same mind that had once secured his throne. The same ghost he had murdered. The same woman. Nighthawk, he breathed, the word a prayer and a curse. She was alive. The knock on the Haven door that evening was not the imperious rap of a prince, but a single, heavy thud, as if the man on the other side had mustered all his strength for that one sound. Kalen opened it, his body trembling. But Prince Valerius did not sweep past him. He stood on the threshold, his face a ghastly mask of pallor and tension. He looked not like a ruler, but like a man who had seen a ghost. His eyes, dark and fever-bright, scanned the room past Kalen, searching. "Leave us," he said, his voice ragged. It was not a command to his own men, but to Kalen and Alara. "Your Highness, Kalen began, but Lyra's voice cut through from behind him. "It's all right, father. Mother. Please." Her parents hesitated, their faces etched with terror, but at their daughter's calm, unyielding tone, they reluctantly withdrew to the kitchen, leaving the main room to Lyra and the prince. Valerius stepped inside and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment as if his legs could no longer support him. The room was lit by a single lantern, casting long, dancing shadows. Lyra stood in the center, having expected this. She had changed back into a simple dress, but the Nighthawk's resolve was in her spine, in the unblinking stillness of her gaze. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the silence thick enough to choke on. The only sounds were the crackle of the hearth and the ragged pull of Valerius's breath. "It's you," he finally whispered, the words torn from him. "It can't be." "But it is." "I don't know what you mean, Your Highness," Lyra said, her voice flat. The denial was a formality, a final, thin shield. Don't, he snarled, pushing off the door and taking a step toward her. A frantic energy crackled around him. Don't lie to me now. Not after what I just saw. The precision. The ruthlessness. You didn't just bankrupt that man, you erased him. You unwove him from the world. That is not the work of a merchant. That is the work of the Nighthawk. He was circling her now, a predator trying to reconcile a memory with a living, breathing impossibility. The way you look at me. That hatred, it's not because I'm a prince intruding on your life. It's personal. It's old. Lyra said nothing. She just watched him, her gray eyes like chips of ice. It was you in the woods, wasn't it? He pressed, his voice rising with hysterical certainty. 3 years ago, when my brother's assassins cornered me. I was half dead, I saw a figure move through the trees like a ghost, taking them down one by one. I never saw a face. I thought I'd dreamed it. But it was you. Even then. He stopped in front of her, his chest heaving. How, Lyra? How? The name, her name, on his lips was a violation. The last of her control shattered. How, she repeated, and a laugh, brittle and sharp as broken glass, escaped her. You stand there, in your ignorance, and you ask me how? The dam broke. A lifetime of loyalty, of love, of sacrifice, and the searing agony of betrayal came flooding out. You want to know how, Valerius? She hissed, stepping forward so they were almost nose to nose. The use of his name without title was a weapon. Then let me tell you. Let me tell you how the Nighthawk, your faithful shadow, died on her feet in the Citadel of Whispers, her body riddled with arrows, watching the last of her onyx guard fall. Let me tell you how she looked toward the capital and heard the bells ringing for your wedding to Lady Evangeline. Valerius flinched as if struck, his face draining of what little color it had left. What are you saying? That's madness. That never, let me tell you, she drove on, her voice trembling with a grief so vast it threatened to swallow her whole, what it feels like to have your life's blood seep into the frozen stones of a border fort, knowing the man you gave everything for is toasting his new bride, his new empire, built on your corpse. Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and furious, but she didn't care. You asked me why I hate you? You asked me why I run? You killed me, Valerius. You gave me a poisoned toast and a smile and you murdered me. And now you have the gall to stand in my home and ask me how I can possibly be here? He was shaking his head, back and forth, like a wounded animal. No. No, Lyra, that was a dream. A nightmare I've had. It wasn't real. Wasn't it? She screamed, the sound raw and primal. Then why do you look at me like I'm a ghost? Why does the thought of it make you tremble? It was real for me. It is all that is real for me. Her words finally broke through his denial. He crumbled. The arrogant prince vanished, and what was left was a shattered, terrified young man. He fell to his knees before her, his hands clutching at the fabric of her skirt. It was Evangeline, he gasped, his words a desperate, tangled plea. The poison, it was her father's scheme. I never meant. I didn't know until it was too late. I swear it, Lyra. I have lived with that guilt every day since. The dreams, they have been torturing me. Lyra looked down at him, at the crown prince of the Obsidian Empire groveling at her feet. She felt nothing. No pity. No satisfaction. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. You didn't know, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. You, the master of spies, didn't know about the plot happening at your own victory banquet? You expect me to believe that? She leaned down, her voice dropping to the deadliest whisper. Or did you just choose not to know? Was the Nighthawk, once so useful, finally an inconvenience to your perfect, political future? He had no answer. A broken sob racked his frame. He looked up at her, his eyes begging for an absence she could never, ever grant. Lyra, please, come back. Come back to me. To the court. I will make it right. I will give you anything. A title, lands, my name. Be my empress. Rule by my side. I will send Evangeline away. It will be just us, as it was always meant to be. It was the same promise. The same gilded cage. The same lie. A slow, sad smile touched Lyra's lips. She reached down and, with an eerie gentleness, pried his desperate fingers from her dress. You killed me once, she said, each word a nail in the coffin of their shared past. You don't get to bury me twice. She walked to the door and opened it. The cool night air washed in. Your Highness, she said, the title of final, formal dismissal. Take your guilt and your crown and your empty promises, and get out of my home. He knelt there for a moment longer, utterly broken. Then, slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. He didn't look at her again. He just stumbled out the door and into the night, a king without a kingdom, a man haunted by the ghost he himself had created. Lyra closed the door and leaned against it, her body trembling with the aftershock. It was over. The truth was out. The score was settled. And for the first time, she was truly free of him. The silence Valerius left behind was different this time. It wasn't the tense, waiting silence of his presence, but a deep, settling quiet, like the calm after a storm has finally passed. The ghost had been exorcised. Lyra stood alone in the main room for a long time, listening to the beat of her own heart. It was steady. The frantic, trapped bird was gone. In its place was a slow, sure rhythm. Her own rhythm. Her parents emerged from the kitchen, their faces etched with a fear that was now mingled with a dawning, bewildered awe. They had heard everything. Lyra. Her mother began, her voice trembling. What was he talking about? Poison? Death? Lyra turned to them. The last vestiges of the Nighthawk's fury had faded from her eyes, leaving only a profound, weary honesty. He was talking about a bad dream, Mother, she said softly. A dream he had, and a nightmare I lived. But it's over now. She didn't explain further, and they, seeing the finality in her gaze, didn't press. They knew, with the instinct of parents, that their daughter had crossed a threshold into a world they could not follow. The girl who fainted over ledgers was gone forever. In her place was a woman who had faced down an emperor and won. The next morning, Prince Valerius and his entire retinue were gone. They had left Sunfall before dawn, without a word, vanishing as suddenly as they had appeared. The only evidence they had ever been there were the deep ruts left by their carriage wheels in the mud. A week later, a royal courier arrived, not with a summons, but with a single, heavy parchment sealed with the imperial signet. It was not addressed to the Haven family, but to the holder of the Sunfall holdings. It was a royal charter of severance. It formally released the Haven family and all their assets from any and all feudal obligations to the Obsidian Crown, in perpetuity. It was the edict she had demanded in her past life, delivered in this one. A final, silent apology and a surrender. Lyra held the parchment, the wax seal feeling like a brand of both victory and loss. He had finally given her what she wanted. He had let her go. That evening, she found Corbin on the deck of the Sea Serpent, watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of fire and gold. He's gone, she said, coming to stand beside him. I heard, Corbin replied, his gaze on the horizon. The innkeeper said they left like the devil himself was on their heels. He looked at her, his blue eyes clear and direct. Did you send him away? In a manner of speaking, Lyra said. She handed him the royal charter. Corbin read it, his eyebrows rising in surprise. He's granting you independence? This is unprecedented. It's a farewell, Lyra said. She took a deep breath, the salt air filling her lungs. You once offered me a cabin. Does that offer still stand? Corbin's face broke into a slow, radiant smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the sun-weathered skin at their corners. Aye, he said, his voice warm. It does. For you, and for your family, if they'll come. They would. Her father, freed from the weight of debt and title, had rediscovered a spark of adventure. Her mother, though nervous, trusted her daughter implicitly. The world of the court had nearly destroyed them, the world of the sea offered a new beginning. The leaving was not a frantic flight, but a planned, peaceful departure. They sold the house in Sunfall, not out of need, but to sever the last tie. They packed only what was essential, clothes, a few keepsakes, her father's favorite books, her mother's recipe box. The day they boarded the Sea Serpent, the entire village turned out to see them off. Old Man Hemlock gripped Lyra's hand, his eyes shiny. You look after yourself, girl. You're one of us. She was, and she wasn't. She was Lyra Haven of Sunfall, and she was the Nighthawk of the Obsidian Court, and she was something new entirely, a woman choosing her own destiny. As the crew hauled up the anchor and the sails caught the wind, Lyra stood at the stern, watching the coastline of the only home she had ever known shrink into a hazy line, then vanish altogether. There was no regret, only a quiet anticipation. Years later, tales would still swirl through the Obsidian Empire. They said Emperor Valerius ruled with a solitary, ruthless efficiency, turning the empire into an unprecedentedly prosperous and orderly realm. But he never took an empress. He never sired an heir. He passed the throne to a carefully selected nephew, whose first act was to tear down the Lyra's Gaze tower his uncle had built, from which he would stare endlessly east, toward the sea. They said he died young, some whispered of a broken heart, others of a slow poison of his own making, a final, bitter toast to a ghost. But on a warm, wind-swept island where the sands were pink and the water was clear, such tales were just stories, told by traders for the price of a drink. Lyra would often sit on the veranda of a villa they had built, overlooking a bay of impossible blue. Her father was the island's beloved storyteller, her mother the heart of its community, famous for her spiced bread. The ledger books she kept now were for their family's thriving export business, exotic fruits, rare shells, and the finest sea salt. Corbin would come up behind her, wrapping his sun-browned arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "A coin for your thoughts," he'd murmur, echoing their first meeting. She would lean back into his solid, steady presence, a smile touching her lips. In the distance, their two children, a boy with his father's blue eyes and a girl with her mother's storm-gray ones, were playing in the surf, their laughter carried on the breeze. She had found a peace she never knew existed. A peace built not on power or secrecy, but on trust, on chosen family, on the simple, profound joy of a sunrise she had chosen to watch. She looked out at the endless horizon, no longer a boundary to be feared, but a promise of tomorrow. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice content. "How free the sea looks today."